in this video, I'm gonna be teaching you how to get industry standard professional sounding drums using an objective approach. I'm calling this video 6 steps to an objectively professional drum mix. This works for any genre in any mix. First, checking phase and polarity. That's there. Regardless of our genre, we still need to check phase and polarity. Second one is gain staging drums. We definitely need to gain stage our drums to ensure that our plugins are operating at their optimal level, as well as we're not just overblowing our mix. We're gonna be using compression to control our drums dynamics and make them awesome and punchy and powerful and all those good traits. We're gonna be using EQ to clean up our drums and obviously make them punch and cut through the mix well. 5 is we're gonna be talking about drum bus processing, how to process your drum bus so that it always sounds pro. And then also number 6 is effects, how to use effects effectively in your drums to get the most out of them. Phase is essentially time-based, polarity is directional based. And I know that this is not the scientific definition of these terms. However, it is the functional definition that you can take and actually utilize in your mixes today. So let's talk about polarity first. In this example, we have a kick in and a kick out, and they are basically the same signal, right? They're miking the same instrument. We have the first one, the kick in, is going down on its very biggest peak. And on the bottom, it's going up on its very biggest peak. What this is going to do, if we overlap these, is they're going to cancel each other out because they're exact opposites. And ultimately, if we have an exact opposite sound wave that hits itself, we are then going to end up with nothing inside of mix. Let's play it and then listen to the kick specifically, because that's where the polarity issue exists. Let's solo that kick. Right, it sounds really hollow, weak sounding, that's not full and punchy. So let's talk about how to fix this. So the first thing that I wanna show you is, let's just take one of those signals and I'm gonna duplicate it. So let's duplicate that track. And then I'm going to dive into the signal chain and grab a gain plugin. And I'm gonna invert the phase, which inverts the polarity, ironically. And let's listen. And no, I did not turn anything down. It's just the fact that because we inverted this signal, it's canceling each other out, so you can't hear anything. Right, so this essentially is happening to our kick in and our kick out. So let's remove that track, zoom in on one of these kicks. If we look really closely, this is happening because the kick out is right mirroring the kick in, up and then down, and then this goes down and then up. So directionally, they are incorrect. So if we fix this kick bottom by doing the same exact move we just did by adding our utility plugin, inverting that phase, and now they're gonna sound way more punchy, full. You're gonna really hear it in the bottom end, so make sure you pay attention to that. Okay, so here's without. Here's with. So you can just tell they're just way more full inside of the mix. So here's the kit overall. Phase now. So phase, as I mentioned earlier, is time-based. Basically, if we have a kick in, a kick out, and they're directionally correct this time, right? So the polarity is not the issue. However, as you can tell, there's still some cancellation going on here because at a different part of the sound, it is now going down, the other part is going up, and therefore we're still gonna end up with this cancellation result. And so this is ultimately what it looks like when you have a phase issue inside of your kick drum. That issue doesn't exist in the kick in this song. However, when we zoom into the snare, we can tell there are some phase issues going on. So if we look at the snare top, it's going up right here. So this is the main fundamental body of that snare, and it's not matched by the snare bottom. As you can tell, the main fundamental is in this region and it's not matching up. So we can just drag this over here and match it up. I like to go right where it kind of inverts, focused on that, just that first major transient, because that's really what's going to impact the tone of this snare overall. So let's listen to that. So here is before, and here is after. So again, there's just a slightly more body to the snare, and the big issue is that we can't fix that with EQ. Even if we tried to, we can't actually go in there and specifically correct the EQ to have sound that's essentially being canceled. So regardless of what we did processing-wise, that we were never going to be able to solve those particular issues. So the next issue that we need to solve with our phase and polarity is that while we've dealt with the issues with our kick in and our kick bottom and our snare top and our snare bottom specifically, we now need to deal with the entire kit overall. For example, these overheads contain a lot of the other sounds in the kit. For example, the kick and the snare and the toms, we can all hear in this overhead. So what we want to do, because these overheads contain every single element in the mix, we need to tie all of our individual elements to that. So for example, we have a nice strong snare hit right here. This will be easy to look at. We can tell these overheads are roughly matching one another. We could probably correct that a little bit, right? So now they're more aligned with that snare hit. And now we can also move down here and look at our snare. Does the snare actually match that? So this is kind of where the first transient starts to really come in. And we can tell our snare is actually just slightly ahead of our overheads. And so I'm going to back that up to match. So we have an optimally aligned snare on both ends. There we go. Perfect. Yeah, now that snare is really powerful. I love that. But we're not done yet because we still need to align the kick. So let's dive into the kick here. And remember, we inverted the phase on the bottom. I just didn't print it, so it is correct. And it's actually looking pretty close, right? That's the first major transient that I see with the overheads. It's looking pretty solid. Let's go over here and ensure that that's still the case. Yeah, down. Yep, up. Okay. Yeah, that's looking great to me. And then the last one, we probably want to deal with the toms as well. So let's just get one of these fills. Yeah, so these are some nice isolated hits on the toms. So here's our first kind of main transient after a full cycle. Looks like, yeah, that's actually pretty well aligned. So that's looking good. Let's go to the mid tom. Okay, so here's the main transient and the overheads. And it looks like it's just slightly ahead, so I'm going to back that one off a bit. And that looks much better. Again, you can't actually perfectly align all of these all the time because the overhead left and overhead right are actually going to pick up the signal of the tom slightly different. As long as we're directionally correct, it's still going to sound full. It's just sound punchy. It's not going to have any major phase issues. Here is the floor tom. And zoom in just a little bit. Let's make these bigger. Because the floor tom is all the way on the right side of the kit, we can tell there's a bit of cancellation between even the overheads here, but I'm focusing on the snare mostly because the snare is by far more important. But here's the kind of the first transient overall. I'm gonna line it more with the right overhead because that's really where it sits in the mix. So let's align it there. And yeah, that is looking solid. Okay. So here is our entire kit now that we've aligned the phase for everything. Okay, here we go. And already we have a more unified, solid sounding kit without using a single plugin. Now we're on to gain staging drums. The first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, what is gain staging to begin with? And in order to ask that question, we need to define what is gain. And so there's an issue because gain is often called volume and volume is often called gain. And these two ideas are fundamentally different. However, they are used to describe the same thing oftentimes because of where it sits in the signal chain. Let me break this down for you very simply. Gain is simply a signal going into a process, regardless of what that process is, whether it's EQ, compression, distortion, a signal chain, anything. Gain is the signal going in, volume is the signal coming out. So the goal of this process of gain staging overall, when we're talking about a signal chain, a plugin, a EQ, regardless of what it is, our goal is to have a certain level of gain going in and the same amount of volume going out. And that is measured in decibels. So if we have 10 decibels going in, we want 10 decibels coming out. So the natural question is, how do we measure this? Because there are two primary ways to measure volume or gain in a signal. It's either going to be average volume or peak volume. Only time I use peak volume is actually at the very beginning of the mix. I'm going to use peak volume to make sure that I have enough headroom in my tracks that any processing I do is not only going to be at the ideal volume for my plugins, but it's also going to leave me plenty of headroom for my mix bus and ultimately not be peaking right from the beginning and ultimately be fighting with my faders the entire mix. So I'm going to use peak volume first, but for all of processing, so EQ, compression, distortion, anything that I do on my tracks, I'm going to use average volume because average volume is what humans actually hear. We're able to better identify if our EQ, say, sounds good after the change. So if I make a change that adds volume, I want to gain stage that back down so it's still matching before and after using average volume. And because that's what I'm hearing, I'm able to then make a more objective decision whether that change was good or bad, because I'm not going to be inclined towards the decision that made the volume higher. The next stage is, where do you actually gain stage in your mix? And I kind of alluded to this. The first place is the raw tracks. Before we start mixing, we need to gain stage our raw tracks or our raw regions inside of our tracks. We want to gain stage EQ, compression, and any effects that we add to the drums as well. So let's dive into gain staging raw tracks. The first rule that you need to understand when gain staging raw tracks is that your peak volume, right? This is the only time we use peak volume in the mix. The peak volume should be between minus 10 decibels and minus 20 decibels. The reason why we do this is that plugins sound ideal when our tracks are within this range. Some hits are going to be quieter, some are going to be louder. However, within that general range, the plugins are going to operate at their optimal capacity because that is how manufacturers designed their plugins to work. Oftentimes I get mixes from students, and this is the first thing that often comes up is that their tracks are peaking at minus 2 decibels, minus 1 decibel, and ultimately our plugins can't deal with that kind of gain going into it. It's just overwhelming it. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose, literally. And your plugins are the ones trying to drink from it, and they just can't do it. They can't handle that much signal going in. So if we actually lower the signal going in and we use a normal garden hose, now they can actually drink it just fine and ultimately deal with our tracks at their optimal capacity. The first step to gain staging is, again, making sure all of our tracks are within that optimal range, so between minus 20 and minus 10 decibels. So there's two ways to do this. The first way is to actually just go in here and listen to, say, the snare top, and we're going to pull up our level meter here on that track. Let's pull up peak volume. So yeah, so we have a couple notes that are peaking above that, so we definitely want to gain it down. One option is to just go into the information panel and actually just gain that down if you're using Logic. There's other functions, right, in other DAWs to do this. The other option is, instead of doing that, we can just do it automatedly inside of Logic. Makes it super easy. We just select all of our drums. Boop. And we can go to Functions, Normalize, Region Gain, and then we can set this to whatever our target is. I'm gonna pick minus 12 just so it gives us a little bit even more room on the upper end of that. And then I wanna pick individual regions. I think it defaults to collective selection. I do not wanna do that because that's gonna take the largest peak in all of the drum regions and then gain it down by that much. I just wanna do individual regions so that they are all peaking at minus 12 at some point in them. So now I hit that. Now you can tell everything's a little bit quieter and actually in a much better range for us to be able to deal with. When this happens, sometimes we're going to end up with sections of tracks that are just too quiet. Like, for example, this is actually very quiet in, say, this region over here. And so we may actually not want that to be the case. So sometimes these hits will actually be too quiet, or you'll find a random hit in here. For example, in this region right here, we can look at our level meter. For example, this hit right here is actually not even peaking at 20. It's minus 20.5, which really isn't that far off. But if we wanted to make our tracks even more consistent, I could just gain this up a couple decibels, and now I have a much more consistent track overall. Again, there's another one that's a little bit quiet, so I might want to gain that one up a bit. And so I'm going to go through that. I'm going to go through my entire snare track and do this just to make sure it's at the optimal gain before I start processing. Sometimes you'll end up with, say, a roll on the snare like this that maybe you don't actually want to be blaringly loud in your mix, and you don't want to go in and adjust each one of these little hits because there are some natural dynamics involved. And that's obviously a great thing to keep in our tracks. We want that feeling of the actual drum performance. So what I'm going to do oftentimes, if there's like a build up, a snare roll to a build up or something, I'm still going to gain it up to the optimal level of whatever peaks it has. So for example, all of these major hits, I'm going to gain those up to be the optimal level. And so, yeah, I can actually use a little bit more. So now my plugins are going to react the optimal way to these, but I can actually use automation later in the mix to bring them back down to where I actually want them inside of the mix, because I want them to be processed at the optimal level, and then later I can automate them down. Okay, and then once you're done with this process, don't forget to just crossfade these to make sure that there's no clicks, pops, weird sections where we're gaining down and then gaining up. Gets a little click or a pop in there. So just make sure you're crossfading those regions. In Logic, you can use this drag crossfade function up here. Make sure, I think it defaults to no overlap. So just don't do that. You make sure it's set to crossfade, and then it'll automatically create these crossfades when you drag regions across one another. But we are actually not done gain staging quite yet. So technically, you could maybe include this in editing or just mixing and not really the gain staging section, but I prefer to view this as gain staging because instead of gain staging up, we're actually gain staging things down. For example, in our tom track, we can see that we have obviously tom hits right here, but there's a bunch of bleed in between the tom hits that's really just not necessary. It's not adding anything beneficial. It may not be actually an issue right now. It will be when we start compressing these toms, because right when we start compressing, all these low signals that we can't hear right now are brought up into the mix, and ultimately it's going to cause phase and polarity issues, but it's also going to cause a whole bunch of just excess noise. Tom mics generally aren't great at picking up kicks or snares or anything like that, whereas we just have bad tones that are introduced to the mix. In our mix right here, especially this middle tom, we can hear there's a whole bunch of noise that's happening inside of it. And you can just see, right? You see it happening inside of this tom track. But every time that snare gets hit, you can hear there's just this resonant frequency that is present inside of this tom. Because this tom isn't hit at all in this entire section, but there's a ton of noise that's introduced to the mix. And so in the section we're working on, and I would do this for the whole mix, is I am going to go through here and actually just kill all of this noise. I'm using the marquee tool, so hit command, and I'm going to select all of this space in between, and I kind of cut off my transient there. And I'm just going to cut all of this stuff in between, so now we don't have any of these issues. And then I'll zoom in and get really detailed to make sure that I don't actually cut off my transient. And then I will also use my fade tool to make sure that I don't have any clicks and pops before and after. And then I'm going to do this for all of my toms here. So here's the before. Here's the after. And I know that you're probably thinking through this whole thing, why don't you just use a noise gate? Isn't that easier? And yes, it's easier. However, it's not nearly as effective as actually going through and being very detailed with your cuts. Because when we actually introduce a noise gate, we're actually not going to be as specific, or there's probably going to be excess noise that's introduced to the track, because if there's a really loud snare hit, from example, from the high tom, that'll actually make its way into the track. And it's just better to be that much more detailed with our treatment of gain staging, and specifically actually removing noise from the track entirely. If you're struggling to get that industry standard quality for your mixes, then go ahead and check out my book, The Objective Mix. It teaches you the objective standards of how to get an industry standard quality mix. There's a link in the description if you are interested in that. Let's get back to the video. Okay, so now we're diving into drum compression. So the very first thing that we're gonna cover is shell dynamic goals, the shell being the kick, the snare, and the toms. The first one is just consistency. You need these to be ultra consistent in the mix, especially for a modern feel for a mix, because we want to be able to hear every single, shadow hit on the snare and every single kick, that even if they're doing some little double pellet action, that their left leg is a little bit weaker than their right leg, we can still hear that occurring inside of the mix. So the first goal is always consistency. The second goal is going to be impact and energy, to make sure that we have this fullness sounding, but also that punch that comes from a well-mixed kick or snare or tom. So what are the common issues with shell dynamics? These are going to relate to the goals, generally speaking, because if their goals aren't met, they're an issue. So the first one is macro dynamic variation. You can tell the first hit is very weak, the second two are very strong. So ultimately we don't have very good macro dynamic variation. Macro dynamics being the overall note to note variation, and micro dynamics being the individual relationship between the tail and the transient of the note, which we're going to dive into a little bit more here in a second. So the next issue that we have with shell dynamics is lack of beefiness or weight behind those, the kick or the snare or the toms. And then the last one is lack of impact and punch, to make sure that it's poking out, it's forward, and ultimately has that nice punch that we're looking for. Let's dive into the actual shell compression chain. I'm going to be talking about types of compression. If you don't know the types or styles of compression, make sure you're getting the compression style guide down below. There's a link in the description, and also likely in a pinned comment that you can download this guide for free. So let's dive into the first stage of the compression, which is consistent type compression and also gain staging. We've already talked about gain staging, and so I'm not going to cover that. However, consistent type compression can definitely play a role in this particular mix, because we definitely have a lot of variation in our tracks, variation in our kicks and the snares and toms that we likely want to control. Consistent type compression is characterized by a very fast attack and a reasonably long release. Long release being the length of whatever note we're trying to compress. Kicks have a very short tail, and so therefore our actual release will be, say, 100 milliseconds. That's actually considered very long in terms of kicks. I'm going to be using a 3-to-1 ratio. That's always my starting point with compression. A very low knee. The reason why I use a low knee when I'm using consistent type compression is because a high knee is going to capture more notes. So basically quieter notes are still going to be compressed, which is actually counter to my goal of creating consistency. I want to bring up quieter notes and bring down louder ones. So by using this knee, I'm only capturing the loudest notes and bringing them down more in line with the quieter notes, and then I can bring them all up to that same level. So here we go. Let's dive into this type of compression. And my goal generally is between 0 and 3 decibels of gain reduction with this type of compression. So in the loudest notes, I'm getting about 3 decibels gain reduction. That's looking perfect. In this case, I'm going to double up on this consistency type compression, because I really want this kick to be very, very consistent before I continue on with any other style of compression. So let's add another layer here. All I did was copy this down, same exact settings. Last thing that we need to do before continuing on is ensure that we are gain staging properly without any compression. RMS is minus 37.4. And with the compression, 37.9, so that's about half a decibel. Perfect. So that is exactly matching. Let's go to the next compressor. It should be 37.4. So with this compression, so it looks like so it's within half a decibel, so that's looking really good to me. So I'm just gonna blanketly apply this to the kick bottom because we gain stage everything to be the same exact volume. This should actually work with the kick bottom as well without changing any settings at all. Let's just double check. That's looking good. I'm gonna back that off just a tiny bit, but it's still looking really great. So let's dial this in quickly with our snares as well. Okay, so without this compression, we're sitting at minus 37.1. Yeah, 1 decibel. There we go. Our second layer. So 37.3 still. 0.1. Okay, that's looking perfect. Now we're going to copy those two over to the snare bottom. All right, and that's looking perfect for the snare bottom. All right, and now we're gonna be using the same exact approach for our toms as well. So we're gonna be applying this consistent type compression. Again, fast attack, slow release, 0 knee, ratio 3:1. Okay, so without compression, so minus 31 exactly. Okay, minus 31.5, so another half decibel or. Oh, that was too much. There we go. It's perfect. All right, copy that down. Our next layer. That's looking perfect. So I'm just gonna copy this to the other toms. It should be pretty close, but let's quickly dial these in. Looking good for and then our floor tom. Consistent shells. All right, so here's without any compression. Here's with compression. And here is in the context of the mix without compression, without consistent compression. So So the biggest area that I hear is in the kick, especially. The kick is just brought out. It's very, very present, much more impactful inside of the mix overall with just a little bit of consistent type compression. So let's keep going though. We have 2 layers of compression yet to go. Okay, so now we're diving into thickness type compression here. The goal of this type of compression is to decrease the transient and increase the tail, which is ironic because this is rather counterintuitive to what we actually want, generally speaking, with our drums. We want very strong transients and very weak tails because that's what's going to create that impact and punch. But thickness is a really great way to just make our drums beefier and fatter, and then we're going to deal with the impact and punch for the next style of compression. Let's use this Studio FET. This is an 1176. I actually really love this on a lot of things, including my kick drum. So let's dial in our very fast attack and very fast release as well. So we're talking 30 milliseconds, maybe even less. So turn all of this auto stuff off. Again, we're going to use a 3-to-1 ratio. I might actually raise this up for this particular style of compression because I'm going to be using this in parallel by using this mix knob here. And I'm getting about 6 decibels of gain reduction, and I plan to mix that in, so it's still following the rule that I don't want to do more than 3 decibels of gain reduction. So let's gain stage this here really quick. So here's without. So 37.2. So 37.2 and 40 is about 3 decibels of gain reduction. So let's add that back. And so now we're going to mix this back into about 50%. This thickness. And so our gain hasn't changed. Again, I just double check that. Some compressors will actually have a very poor gain staging when it comes to this mix. So just watch out for that on various compressors. Logic is actually really good. They don't add gain by doing that. We're going to be adding more compression to the drum bus, so I don't want to overdo it right now with this particular thickness type compression. So I'm just going to add that to the kick out. So what I don't like about this compression is that it's bringing out some of those resonant frequencies inside of the kick that are just ringing out those harmonics. And so I don't necessarily love that. However, I do like the additional thickness it's adding. So I'm going to keep that in mind. I'm hearing some resonances that I'm going to have to deal with EQ later. So just something to keep in mind for the future. Now let's dial in our snare top, fast attack, fast release, and 3-to-1 ratio. So let's go probably about 6 decibels of gain reduction, then mixing in about 50%. So 37.1 RMS. 37. So another half decibel here. There we go. And now that is perfectly gain staged. Let's mix that back to 50%. So here's without. Here's with. So it's just slightly more beef, slightly more power to that snare, which is really nice. Again, I'm not going to overdo it because there's lots more compression to come. So let's just copy that down to the snare bottom, double check that that is working as intended. Toms, again, I'm just going to copy the same exact over. Settings should be almost identical. Okay, so here's without, minus 31.6 with, minus 31.6. Perfect. So I didn't have to do anything, and that was exactly the right move. So I'm just going to copy that over to the medium and floor tom in here. Yep, that's about 6. And then over here, yeah, that's looking great as well. So here's without thickness type compression. tiny bit more beef, tiny bit more just thickness and power with these. Okay, so the next type of compression that we're gonna be adding to these drums is punchy type compression. So punchy type compression is increasing the transient and decreasing the tail of the notes. This is very intentional because I can just balance this perfectly with the thickness and the punchy type compression. If I want more thickness, I can just add more thickness type compression, or if I want the drums to be more punchy, I can just add more punchy type compression. So I can just balance these perfectly because we're decreasing the transient with the thickness and then increasing the transient with the punchy. I can just balance it exactly as I want to with my shells. Punchy type compression, we want to use a long attack to avoid compressing the transient, and then a long release to capture that tail of the note. So again, we're gonna start with the kick in like usual. In between those closer hits, it's really making it all the way back to 0 before the next one, which is exactly my goal. I want it to just barely reach 0 before compressing the next hit. That means I'm hanging on to that tail as long as possible. Okay, so let's gain stage this really quick. So here's without. So 37.4. And that's 39. So that is 1.5 or 2.5 decibels. No, that was too much. 1.5. $35.4. Yeah, maybe another half decibel. All right, that's looking good though. Now let's dial in our snare top. So punchy style compression, again, longer attack, longer release, 3-to-1, 3 decibels gain reduction. Let's get a little higher ratio here. Ooh, yeah, that's just sounding so good with this snare. Okay, so here's gain staging really quick. So without, so 37.3, 37.9, so 1.5. Okay, so here's without. Oh yeah, that is delicious. I'm just copying that over to the snare bottom. That's 43.3. Continue on with the high tom. That's way too much. Okay, that's sounding pretty good there. For 31.6 after 31.5. All right, so perfect. We had 1.5 decibels of gain reduction there. So let's copy that over to our medium tom. I'm pretty sure these will all work perfectly as the other ones have. Yep, that's looking good. And then our floor tom. Now let's do a quick A/B of everything. So here is the drum kit without any compression at all. The only thing that I want to fix is I want to add just one more layer of punchy style compression to the kick bottom. It's still just a little bit not impactful enough. So let's add another layer here and then we'll probably call it. Yeah, that's looking just about perfect still. All right, so here is that. Talk about our overheads. So we've been focusing on the shell elements now. Now let's look at overhead dynamic goals. So the first thing we need is just consistency. And that's really all we need with the overheads. All the overheads are providing is additional snare information and cymbal information. Oftentimes we'll even high pass this so that we don't even have much kick in the overheads as well. So it's really just the kind of the shiny elements that are being picked up with the overheads. Let's talk about the go-to overhead compression chain, which is just gain staging, first of all, and then secondly, consistent type compression or thickness type compression. So we want to just reduce the volume of the kick and the snare in the overheads, and we just want to bring up those cymbals. I'm going to reach for thickness type compression. If there's a good balance and I still don't mind having the snare in there, then I'm going to be using a more consistent type compression. Regardless if it's thickness or consistent type compression, I'm always using an incredibly fast attack. So this is really going to be triggered off of the snare because that's what the overheads are picking up. That's all those peaks. The loudest parts of this track are those snares, and we just want to even out everything inside of this track. So let's go ahead and start that process. I guess it's barely getting back to 0. That's exactly what I wanted. Let's copy that over to the overhead right as well. Okay, so let's gain stage this just to make sure that we're treating these properly. So without. So 34 and 35. So the left needs one decibel and the right needs 1.5. So it just kind of brings forward all of those other elements in between. And I really like the snare in the overheads. It actually sounds really nice. And so I'm not trying to just reduce the snare and bring up the cymbals. I'm going to utilize a lot of that snare characteristic in the overheads in this mix. So here is the before and after. So here is no compression with individual drums. EQ for drums. So let's get started. The first one we're going to cover is kick. The first problem that we have with kick is a low rumble. So the low rumble is going to be in this region right here, but anything below 35 hertz, you really can't hear in a kick anyway. We just don't need this information in the kick at all. We're going to cover our kick in first and see if there's any low rumble here to even deal with. You know, there's some energy down there, but really not anything to concern ourselves with. I'm not actually going to make this move. You could just cut that off a little bit, but in this case, there's not enough energy down there to really warrant this move. So I'm just going to choose not to do anything for this kick in. Let's check the kick out while we're here, just to see what's going on here. Yeah, there's a little bit more buildup there. The next EQ move that we're going to want to pursue is the fundamental of the kick. So this is the core fundamental of the kick. Generically speaking, we want to emphasize this because this is where the core sound of that low end of the kick actually lives. Okay, so it looks like it's around 40, 50 hertz maybe. Let's look in the kick bottom. Yeah, so that right there looks kind of like it's the fundamental, but that's just a really strong harmonic, and you can hear that ringing. And there might be one right there too. So this still is the core fundamental though, which is that, 40 to 50 hertz boost right at that kick fundamental. And back it off to 3 decibels. So it does look like it's right at that 50 hertz almost exactly. So let's make that slightly more narrow. Yeah, that looks good. All right, and we're gonna make the same exact move with our kick bottom right at that 50 hertz region. Ooh, yeah, that sounds good. While we're at it, because this is just really strong right here, we're just gonna reduce that. Oh, that sounds so much better. Okay, so the next one that we're going to want to deal with is any masking that is occurring inside of the kick. In a bass, you'll have a fundamental of the bass somewhere in this low region, right? Fighting with the kick exactly. And so we want to deal with this masking going on because the kick right here, as you can see, is masking all of that area that is the fundamental of the bass, which the fundamental of the bass, right, in this case is 70 hertz. Let's go over to our bass in order to inform what we're gonna do here. Okay, so it looks like it's sitting right around that 80 to 100 hertz region. And there's a little bit of, fighting here as well, right where the kick's fundamental is. So we're gonna be making some moves on both of those areas. So the first one is that kick fundamental, that 50 hertz. I'm just gonna bring that down by about 3 decibels. I'm gonna boost this whole upper area because it's right around that 100 hertz, but because the fundamental moves around on the bass a little bit, I'm just gonna boost that whole area. So let's go ahead and gain stage this really quick because this is the only move I'm gonna make on the bass at this time. Okay, so 32.7. So we need to lose 1.5 decibels. Okay, a little bit more. I'm gonna make that same cut here on the kick in that we just did with this guy. I'm gonna broaden this a little bit, just to extra room here. Okay, so here's before that move. There's just way more room for that bass to breathe. And then also the kick's actually a little bit quieter. And so we're gonna be dealing with that here in a second with some gain staging. The kick is just more focused now. It's focused in the area that I need it to be rather than just living in that whole bottom end, fighting with the bass guitar. So we're not actually done with masking quite yet. The kick also lives in this upper region, right? So 125 to 500 hertz. And sometimes it's actually very, very present in this region that not only sounds generally kind of wooden sounding. When we're looking at this region though, we also want to look at the rest of the mix. So the guitar's living here, the vocals are living here, the bass is also living here. And so essentially we're just running into all these items that would better serve them rather than the kick. So we just want to move the kick out of the way of those elements in the mix. So this is the kick in that we're looking at now. And you can just tell that area just doesn't sound good. There's no like good quality that's being brought out in that area. All right, kick bottom. Okay, so now I'm gonna be dealing with that harmonic that's really cutting through. It's just ringing out a frequency that just continues after the rest of the note dies. That's generally a resonant frequency, so it's resonating with something else inside of the room or in the kit or anything along those lines. So we're gonna be searching for that and cutting that out here in this kick bottom because it's just ringing, it's not very pleasant, and it doesn't serve our goals of a nice, tight, punchy, powerful kick. So you can hear it's just that tone is just continuing even after the note is dead. So we're gonna go ahead and just get real surgical and cut that all the way out. And so here's before. All right, so the next issue or next move that we're going to want to pursue with the kick is the definition of the kick. So the definition will live in this range somewhere with all kicks. Most of the time, I find people trying to boost in this 3K range a lot with kicks, even though the 3K range is kind of the magic frequency of bringing stuff forward, which again is the reason why everybody's boosting here, because it brings the kick forward in the mix and makes them feel like the kick is right up front where it needs to be. However, it's also going to be introducing excess harshness in the mix, and also it prevents you from boosting other elements there, and then you're going to cause additional masking, such as the lead vocal will generally sound really good in that 3K range. Guitars sound great in that 3K range. Basically everything, especially in a rock mix, rock context, is going to sound great in that range, and it's going to bring it forward. However, kick, obviously, if we're boosting the kick in that range, end up fighting with all those other elements. In our mix, what we want to do is actually boost above that. Where I find myself boosting the most is around 6 to 8K for the kick. Again, that 7 kilohertz range sounds really nice. It just brings out that beater head, and that's going to cut through the mix really well. So let's go ahead and do that same move over here. Just going to do a broad shelf here. And then I'm going to roll off the top end a little bit on this kick bottom. All right, that sounds way tighter, way better. All right, so our last move here is just to gain stage these EQs here really quick. So let's hear without the kick in where we're at. So minus 37.5. Minus 38, so I think that's half a decibel. Yeah, and then kick bottom. Minus 35.5. Okay, that's about a decibel and a half. Maybe a little bit more even. All right, that's sounding great to me. Yeah, it sounds so much better with that in. Okay, now let's dive into the next EQ, which is EQ for snares. We're gonna be dealing with bleed from the kick. And if you look at your analyzer, this is what that will look like. It doesn't seem like an issue, but if we just remove that, it cleans up the kick. Oftentimes we weren't really focused on the phase relationship between the snare and the kick, so this will just clean all of that up, remove any phase, detract from the kick, and ultimately have a much cleaner sounding kick and snare. Here's that move. Let's make sure that we even have any bleed before we actually just start randomly cutting stuff. Oh, let's mute that. So I can definitely hear the kick coming through, and so let's go ahead and just move that up. I think it's actually mostly coming through this kind of like higher, like 80 to 100 hertz region, but we can probably cut up until there. And I can see the fundamental of that snare is right at that kind of 210 maybe region. So I'm pretty safe by going up to about 100. I'm not cutting off any of that fundamental. Take a look at the snare bottom. Oh yeah, it's getting way more of that kick in there. So let's go ahead and add our EQ. Same exact move. Okay, so our next area for the EQing the snare is the meat of the snare. And so that's really gonna be looking at this fundamental of the snare. So I will almost always boost right below the fundamental because I want even more of that just body, that like oomph of the snares. So right there, it's very easy to identify that fundamental. I'm gonna go 50 hertz below the actual fundamental. All right, and then I'm just gonna copy that over to the next one because we basically did the same exact moves. Okay, so the next one that we're going to be dealing with is harmonics. So in this case, we have a very distinct harmonics happening, and you can hear that ringing, and that's really these harmonics at work just ringing out. It's the tone of the snare. And in this case, a kind of a nice, desirable quality. Depending on what we're going for, if we're going for a very, kind of retro sounding snare, generally we're going to leave these harmonics in there. If you want a very dry, modern snare sound, then you're going to want to cut these out. So I'm just going to show you exact harmonics, even though I already said we're not going to cut them out in this snare. So you can tell there's a really strong one right here. You can just look at the analyzer and tell there's one right here. There's another one right here. There's another one right there. And then the last really strong one is right around here or so. Depending on what our goals are, I think that the harmonics sound nice. However, I don't want too much of those inside of my overall snare tone. And so I'm just going to gently cut this whole area, keep them under control, but just not cutting them out completely. All right, so the next one we're gonna be running into is snap, crackle, and pop. So this is really where the just aggressive, that crack of the snare comes in, and I couldn't find another analogy for this characteristic of the snare other than breakfast cereal. So this is where the crack comes in. And we can tell right around this like 250 or 2.5K is really where that is coming out. Yeah, because if I go down here, I'm getting that like kind of last really strong fundamental. So maybe at that 2K is best. Yeah, let's do 2.1. That sounded great to me. And take a look at the snare bottom as well. The last one is brightness and sizzle. So this is going to be the brightness of the snare, all of that top end information. Oftentimes you'll hear a lot of modern snares, especially being boosted here heavily because it gets that nice crispy quality out of the snare. I'm also going to roll off some of this top end because we're used to hearing a lot of snares, toms, kicks, basically all drums being run through tape saturation. So, especially back in the day, we were just recording everything to tape. And so we ended up rolling off this top end because that's what tape naturally does. It rolls off that top end. So we can actually just emulate that with an EQ here if we don't want to add tape saturation, what we perceive as being a good snare. And so I'll just boost the top end and then roll off anything basically starting at 10K and above, we can just start rolling off. But I can, again, boost this top end to get the exact amount of sizzle that I want out of here. Go here for the snare top. No more than 3 decibels. Okay, and then also to remind you that there's a lot of that snare tone that's actually coming through in these overheads as well. So if we just solo these, a lot of that stereo snare overhead sound, right? The crispiness is also coming out of these as well. So we're gonna get even more crispiness out of the snare. So I'm not trying to over boost it in the actual snares right here. Otherwise, that we're just gonna end up with a very harsh, tinny sounding snare to ensure that we are gain staging all of these moves. So the snare without snare top. Okay, 37.4. 37.5. Okay, we don't really need to do any gain staging there because it's already the same. Double check the snare bottom. Minus 42.9. Okay, 43.4. So it could lose a little bit of gain here. Okay, so let's dive into EQ for toms. This is gonna look very familiar. The first thing we're gonna be focused on is the fundamental of the toms. And so again, very easy to recognize because it's gonna be the loudest point on the frequency analyzer, and it's gonna be that lowest. And we're gonna be starting with the high tom. Okay, so we can easily identify that fundamental right here. So we wanna boost that. And there's no kind of mud going on down here. There's possibly a little bit, so I'm just gonna gently roll that off. And that ultra low end. Similar to the snare, there's going to be harmonic information that's going to be translated in most toms. Unless it's really, really dead, they had, a lot of drum stickies on there to just completely kill all of the ringing and harmonics from the tom. We're going to have some of these present in the mix. And so, for example, in this one, you can tell there's a very strong harmonic right at that kind of 200 area. This is almost always what you'll see with our toms. So here we go, looking at any harmonics here. I want these toms to be really dead sounding, so any harmonics that I find, I'm definitely going to be cutting. So it looks like there could be one right at that 400 range. So let's look for that. And I can tell that that is the harmonic because it's really poking out when I go over that, right? So obviously it sounds bad no matter where I go, but that part is just extra, extra loud when I roll over it. So I can tell that that is a true harmonic and I'm not just boosting noise there. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut, be very surgical with that. Yeah, so it's sounding just nice, more full and heavy right there. So that's great. Balloon effects. This is the only way that I can use to describe this area of the frequency spectrum for toms because it just sounds like a balloon when we boost it there. It just sounds like, a little kid running around with one of those balloons, just like waving it back and forth and it's smacking off his hand. We don't want that in our mix. It just sounds terrible. It sounds cheap. And ultimately we should be cutting here on all toms. I can actually safely say that all toms should not have hardly any mid-range in them, automatically make them sound cheap. And you can just tell, this sounds like a balloon. So I'm gonna be cutting there, sweeping cut. Just has so much more focus. It's great. Okay, so the last one we're gonna be looking at is impact and definition. So the definition, similar to the kick and the snare, is all in this upper range. So we're gonna find a nice sweet spot for this tom to live as well in that range. So I think I like this upper range. I could go as low as probably 5.5K, but I really like the 8K range on this guy. It's just nice and really crispy. It's delicious. All right, and similar to the other shells, we can just roll off some of this top end. Again, the overheads are picking up a lot of that top end already. All right, and our last stage of this EQ is to gain stage it really quick. Okay, without EQ, is 31.1 with 29.4. So we need to lose about a decibel. Okay, so let's quickly EQ the rest of these toms as well. So let's move on to the next one, the medium tom. Okay, so we can tell that fundamental obviously is gonna be moving down. I can just right at that 120 hertz region right there. And there's a really strong harmonic right there. I'm just gonna cut that one out. right, and then again, our balloon sound here in the middle. Don't need that, that's just gross. And then our top end definition. Yeah, I'm liking this even 8.5 K range. And then again, rolling off the top end. Let's gain stage this. So minus 38. Minus 38, we can actually gain up a little bit. All right, let's move on to the next one, which is the floor tom. Okay, so we can tell that fundamental is right at that 70 hertz. And we might be tempted to say, oh, there's probably going to be masking going on between this floor tom and the bass because we did that with the kick. And that's probably true. However, we generally don't need to deal with that because the floor toms almost never hit. Unless we're just riding on the floor tom the whole time in the mix, or we want to get really specific and automate a little bit of EQ in here just to get it out of the way of the bass and vice versa. I will just wait until I can actually hear an issue if I'm going through and doing my relational EQ later in the mix and I identify that as a problem, then I will deal with it. But I'm not going to deal with that right now, except for the kick, because I know that the kick is always going to have that issue. So let's go into this floor tom. Okay, so we boosted here. Let's find that fundamental again. I want really dry sounding toms, so this that's not really helping right at that 120 hertz range. And there's another one right there. And then our balloon sound, right? That's just not needed. We're gonna go real broad with this. And then we're going to boost that top end. All right, and gain staging. So without, minus 34. So we need to lose about a decibel. We have our overheads that we also need to go ahead and start to EQ. On your overheads, you'll almost always only have one move, and that's just gonna be a high shelf because we wanna bring out that crispiness of the cymbals. It's really the only thing that's living in these overheads. Once in a while, I'm going to do a gentle slope on the bottom, high pass just to get rid of some of that low end mud, but I don't wanna lose any of that snare tone either. So the only thing I'll be cutting out is basically the kick fundamental. Okay, now we want to gain stage that. So here's without those. Okay, so 34 and 35 with. Yeah, so we probably gained a little bit, but not too much. So let's gain that down just a tad. We haven't even touched the drum bus yet. So here is without any EQ. unable to get that professional sheen or quality or vibe for your songs, then I want to let you in on a little secret. Most mixers are trying to compensate their lack of professional mixes by getting more plugins, by using more advanced tips or tricks or techniques in their mixes, or relying on buying more professional gear in order to compensate for their lack of quality mixes. But in reality, most mixers' core problem is actually mixing subjectively, or approaching mixing from just a creative mindset entirely. Obviously, mixing is still a somewhat of a creative skill. It's actually far more objective than most people realize. Because if we think about it, everyone agrees on what a professional mix actually is. If that weren't the case, then it would be an entirely subjective field. But in reality, mixing is actually incredibly objective because everyone agrees on what a pro song sounds like. And so mixing objectively can actually help you avoid being your own worst enemy inside of your mixes, and ultimately allow you to just check all of the boxes that a professional mix should check, and then your mix will sound objectively professional. And so if you're mixing your own music and you're motivated to actually learn the objective skill of mixing, and if you want to ensure that your music sounds pro, then I would love to help you out by teaching you the 5 objective standards that everybody is judging your mix by, and how you can use objective mixing to solve those 5 problems inside of your mix, and then also how to do all of that in under 3 hours per song without pro gear, premium plugins, or utilizing templates or presets. So if this is something that piques your interest, then go to theobjectivemix.com to order my brand new book, The Objective Mix. This will teach you how to mix objectively professional mixes every single time you sit down to mix. This provides you with my entire mixing workflow, along with all of the breakthrough lessons that I've learned in the last 16 years of mixing music. So if that is interesting to you at all, then again, go to theobjectivemix.com or click the link right below this video. Can't wait to see you on the inside. With that, let's get back to the video. Okay, so now we're diving into the drum bus. And here's my go-to bus compression chain without any further ado. I'm gonna be adding is a thickness type compression in parallel. So just a reminder, thickness type compression is decreasing the transient and increasing the tail. This is just to give the entire drum bus a little bit more meat, and then also have the entire drum bus just move in rhythm with one another. So the cymbals are being ducked a little bit by the snare and the kick, creating a lot of glue, but also some additional thickness in the drums entirely. So let's go ahead and add that very first layer of compression. Again, this is our thickness type compression. I'm gonna start 3-to-1. I might go a little higher than that on this. Fast attack, fast release, low knee. Let's gain stage this really quick. So minus 30, basically. So 3 decibels. Yeah, you can just tell how much thicker that is. It's bringing up those cymbals, sounding really nice to me. So, but it's a little extreme. So I'm gonna back it up 50%. Kind of brings up all those details that are otherwise getting lost in the drum mix. Okay, so our next type of compression is punchy type compression. This should not be a surprise. This is just bringing up kicks and snares, just adding some more impact again overall to the kit. And this will actually add a little bit of pumping as well to the cymbals, which usually we're trying to avoid that sort of movement. However, in this case, it actually sounds really good if we hear this kind of pumping in the cymbals. It just adds more energy to the drums overall, and you'll hear it actually a lot in many drum mixes that you'll hear on the radio, especially for rock. So if you're listening to a rock mix on the radio or just on Spotify, wherever, pay attention to those drums. You're gonna hear a lot of those pumping in the cymbals. A little higher knee this time, and I'm gonna use a longer attack. So I'm gonna start at 50 milliseconds, longer release. So I'm gonna start probably, let's say 400. I might move that faster. And then I'm going to use a 3-to-1 ratio. So I'm moving my release faster because when I have it at 400, it's not actually making this all the way back to 0. There's no point in actually compressing more if my compression never actually fully releases, because it's just being more extreme with the same exact type of compression. Because remember, our goal with compression is the relative difference between the peaks and the valleys, or the transients and the tails. That is the goal with compression. So if we're just being more extreme, we're not actually creating more difference there. I'm moving this faster so my needle can actually make it all the way back to 0 before that next major hit. Yeah, you can tell right when I add this compression, those cymbals all of a sudden appear to just be turned down a little bit. Okay, so 30. So 1.5. I could probably go 1.5 decibel more. Yeah, so here's without. Okay, so now we're diving into drum bus EQ. Now that we've compressed the drum bus, we got to EQ it. So the first thing that we're going to be dealing with in the drum bus EQ is low rumble. Again, similar to the rest of the tracks, if there's anything that made it through or the compression brought out, we want to deal with that with EQ. So that's, again, going to be in this low area around here. Take a quick gander and see if there's any actual low rumble that we need to deal with. Yeah, there really is some stuff going on down here, so I'm going to go ahead and cut that out. Let's pull up our multimeter here as well. All right, so now we're going to deal with the fundamentals. So oftentimes we'll be boosting on these fundamentals if we feel like they could be enhanced a little bit more with our drums. So the two fundamentals that are the most key is the kick and the snare. As you can see in this image, you have the kick right at that 60 right below 60 hertz, and then the snare right at that 200 hertz. So those are going to be the key points that we may consider boosting, or just boosting this whole area, because it's also going to be allowing us to boost some of the fundamentals of the toms as well. Okay, so let's see if we even want to boost some of the fundamentals here inside of our kit. So I'm still getting a little bit of just like rumble here. Gonna want to deal with that in the kick. I think I need another layer of EQ there, but I think the fundamentals could be brought out a little bit more. All right, so the next thing that we're going to be dealing with is masking. Again, this middle area is the most common area that we're going to have any masking going on. So we're going to want to be very, very cautious about boosting here especially, but oftentimes we can do with a nice little cut here to get this out of the way of the rest of the mix. Especially in thick rock mixes, we're going to be ending up with a lot of masking going on. So let's bring in the rest of the mix and you can hear that just happening. It just kind of kills all that energy in that mid-range, all those guitars, even the vocals a little bit. Is just covering up a lot of that stuff. So, and it's also just doesn't sound good. So I'm going to just do a very broad cut, not anything too dramatic. Again, we've already EQ'd these elements, so they already sound pretty good. This is just nudging it in those last few corners that we want it to be in. All right, and then the last one is harshness. Aggressiveness is going to be in this kind of 2 to 3K range. Again, if we want it to be more aggressive, we might end up boosting here, or if it's sounding a little bit harsh, we might be cutting here as well. And so I'm going to be cutting here just slightly because I want to get it out of the way of the guitars. The guitars are really living in this 2 to 3K range. I know that the drums are just going to get in the way if I end up boosting there. All right, and then the last one is brightness, crispiness. Again, similar to everything else, the brightness and crispiness is always in this top range, 8K plus. And so let's go ahead and boost there a little bit in our drum bus. It's going to sound really nice. And so with that move, I'm also boosting these overheads a lot, and so I'm just going to bring them down just a tad here. And then I think the kick could be brought out just a tad. But again, I'm ending up with a lot of issues with this kick bottom in this 100 hertz range because it's just so strong there. So we're going to do an additional EQ, additional cut. All right, and so what I'm kind of struggling with a little bit is that I want to add a sample to this, but because I know that the original intention was to have a very live sounding drum kit, I'm not going to add a sample to it. Although if you want a true modern drum sound, you will need to add samples to your drums if you have live drums. Okay, so here's a quick A/B of just the drum bus, right? I've only done 3 moves: some thickness type compression, punchy type compression, and then EQ. So here's before. All right, so now we are on to drum effects. The first drum effect that's going to almost automatically level up our drums is saturation and distortion. This is going to add additional thickness and also additional just sonic harmonic information that just sounds great with drums. I had a very, very difficult time mixing my drums until I started adding saturation and distortion to the drum bus, because that is just so characteristic of that drum sound that you're used to hearing on Spotify or wherever you listen to music. And I'm going to be choosing to use a tape saturator because this is just very characteristic of drum buses that we're used to hearing, or drums that we're used to hearing. So here we go. Here's without. It's just that sound that we're so used to hearing, and all of a sudden now it's very much in that direction of a more professional drum mix. So one other option that we have, stock plugins such as just a normal distortion plugin is oftentimes a really great option as well. If you don't have tape saturator or anything, we can just use this. Oftentimes I'll be adding these to the individual tracks as well. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this on our kick in, also our snares. Yeah, it's just fattening those guys up. And I really like that tape on that drum bus. It's sounding the last thing I'm going to do, let's just add that to the toms as well. I think it's going to sound really nice. Yeah, that sounds awesome. After saturation and distortion, we have reverb. And reverb is a very interesting topic when it comes to drums. because there's approved reverbs, which is plate reverb and chamber reverb. And the reason that these are the approved reverbs is that there are no early reflections when it comes to these types of reverbs. These are basically made up reverbs that don't really exist in real life in terms of we don't hear this in everyday life. A plate reverb is literally a metal plate that we attach electrodes to produce sounds, which then creates this reverb effect. Chamber reverbs are where we're actually sending a signal from a recorded snare, say, and then we're sending it to a speaker that's in an attic, and then we have a mic on the other side of the attic that's then picking up that reverb. So there's essentially no early reflections because it's just one single chamber that's picking up all the sound all at the same time. Technically speaking, there are early reflections in chamber, but functionally speaking, there are no early reflections in either of these reverbs, and they're very safe to use with drums if we want to add some drum reverb, specifically with our snare. So let's go in and add just a little bit of a reverb to these snares, because plate reverb, we're going to be using any plate reverb will do. You don't need to have premium plugins, but this is just an easy one to dial in. Let's use this gold plate. I think it's going to sound really nice. And then I'm going to EQ this a little bit because I don't want to add too much bottom end to this signal because it's just going to muddy up the mix. So I'm going to slowly shave off the top and bottom here just to move the reverb a little bit back from the snare itself. And then I'm going to back off a little bit more actually on this bottom end. I'm hearing too much of those harmonics poking through. I'm really liking this 2K range, so that's where I'm cutting here to avoid that. All right, and then obviously that's a little bit too much, so let's back off the time. And then also just the amount of signal going to that reverb. It just kind of lengthens that snare a little bit, just enough to bring more life into it, which I think sounds awesome. Another option, if you want to go for a more stylistic type of reverb, you could go for a reverb and a gate. So essentially, a gated reverb is going to then have a lot of reverb and then cut it off. So it's very characteristic of a lot of 80s songs. You'll hear this like, and then it'll just immediately cut off. That is a gated reverb. Basically, we're just adding a gate to the end of the reverb to cut off that tail. All right, so the next one that we're going to be diving into is the drum room effect. So in our drums that we don't have a room, which is a great way to just add more thickness, just kind of bring the whole drum kit to life. And so if we don't have those drum rooms, we can actually create a drum room for ourselves by using this effect. Talking about how to set up the drum room, this is our generic setup that we have. So all of our kick, snare, toms, overheads, all that stuff is going to the drum bus, which is then going to our mix bus. So we're going to add another bus here that's going to create this drum room effect. So this is now the drum room. So we send all of our individual items, including the overheads, to the drum room, which the drum room is then going to be processed and then sent back to the drum bus, essentially creating another track that doesn't actually exist in our mix, but it can exist because we're able to create it. And then inside of the drum room, we're going to have our drum tracks obviously going to this room, which is going to be a room reverb. So we want to intentionally use a specific room reverb because this is going to emulate a real space that we're used to hearing, like a studio, a live room, something similar to that. There are two types of reverbs that exist in the DAW and plugins. And these are algorithmic versus convolution reverbs. So algorithmic reverbs is essentially, as the name would imply, it's just an algorithm. It's taking in sound and then as an algorithm to then produce some sort of reverb on the back end that is meant to loosely relate to a real life space, versus convolution reverbs are actually where an acoustician actually goes to a room like a church or a hall or even a generic studio room, and they will measure different signals coming out of the speaker, and then they measure the signal in various areas of the room to essentially create a reverb using a real life space. So convolution reverbs are way more CPU intensive, so they're going to use more energy from your computer to actually run them, but they're also much more accurate when it comes to these types of reverbs. And in this case, we always want to use convolution reverbs if we have access to them. Logic even has some stock options, so if you're using Logic, you're in luck. We already have those inside of our stock suite of plugins. Reverbs that you do not want to use in this case are plate reverbs or chamber reverbs. Again, because these don't have early reflections, part of the whole point of adding this room reverb is to make it sound like it's in a real room, in a real space. And so these would actually not benefit us because they don't have those early reflections, and therefore they don't actually emulate a real space. Rooms to use is a room reverb or a hall reverb. I always lean towards room reverbs. They are the safest option by far. Halls tend to be a little bit too big and too boomy, so if you have a very empty mix, it can be a good option. But if you have a thick mix like the one that we have, we definitely want to be leaning into that room. And it's also what we're used to hearing, so it's going to sound the best with our drums. And then we're going to send that to a thickness type compression that's very, very aggressive. And so this is going to completely blow my 3 decibel rule out of the water in terms of we're only going to compress 3 decibels at a time. However, it's acceptable because the rest of the drums, the main drums, are not being compressed with this compressor. This is just an additional drum bus room, an additional room mic, essentially, that's going to just add additional thickness. So it's kind of like using this in parallel, although we have this obviously reverb in front of it to change the characteristic of it. And then after that, we're going to be sending that to the drum bus to be further processed by the drum bus to unify this room with the rest of the bus and ultimately create a really awesome sounding, lively drum mix. So the first step to set this up is just grabbing every single item that we have in our mix and sending it to another bus as we discussed. And this bus is going to be our room bus. So we're going to call it drum room bus. And then we're going to, on the output of this, we want to take this bus and then go back to the drum bus, which is bus number 1. So now we have a signal going from all of these tracks to the drum bus and then to the drum room and then to the drum bus. And then we're going to set up our initial reverb, and we're going to be using this Space Designer. So the difference between this Chromaverb and the Space Designer is a convolution reverb, and then the Chromaverb is an algorithmic reverb. So we want to use this Space Designer. That does sound good. I like that. Let's try a hard studio just for comparison. Yeah, it's a little bit too lively. Let's do recording room. I don't hate that. That one's actually pretty cool. Let's go back to the hard studio or the drum booth. Yeah, I think I like this one more. So I'm gonna go ahead and use this guy. And I used a reverb with a very short decay because I don't want, again, this mix is very full, and so I don't want to have this drum room take up too much space, even though it's gonna be very quiet in the mix. So our next step is to add an ungodly amount of compression to this. And let's solo just the drum room here. Yeah, man, that kick sounds super cool out of this this reverb. I'm gonna add another EQ just to roll off some of this bottom end. We're getting some build up. And so now our job is to just mix this in with the context of the drums. And again, this would be very, very subtle in this mix, although we're definitely going to get some nice characteristics, some nice just liveness from this bus. Okay, so here's without.